Hey, what's up? Liron here. Thank you for joining me in another video. This time, I want to paint this seascape with you. There's quite a lot of complexities here, especially when it comes to the portrayal of waves and ripples and foam and sparkle on the water's surface. So quite a lot going on here. A lot of things that require really good understanding of the scene, careful observation, and good application of dry brush in conjunction with wet and wet and dry on wet. So quite a lot of techniques, sorry, wet on dry, quite a lot of techniques here, a lot of complexities, and I did end up adding a lot of opaque paint, but I think you're gonna get a lot out of this process. So let's jump into it. I'm going to show you exactly how I did this one. So the beautiful thing about this process is the drawing stage is fairly simple. Now, the more detailed you go, the slower you work. Obviously, that's a good investment for the painting stage, but with that, it's not that difficult in terms of, and obviously if you are really inexperienced, you may have some trouble with it, but the scene is very organic, okay? So there isn't anything that's human-made. We don't have any significant perspective or anything like that. So what I'm looking at is, because the scene, I kind of like the way it looks, I like the pattern of ripples and waves and all of that, I will focus on keeping it pretty much the same as I see it. The thing that does matter to me is where I'm drawing all of these things that essentially are going to be the highlights, okay? When you look at the waves crashing against the rocks and the different ripples and patterns in the water, these are all, hopefully, will be paper white. Now, I wasn't able to save all the white areas, and you'll see me use opaque paint, as I mentioned, but it's still a very interesting approach and process to view, despite a lot of the things not going exactly as I planned necessarily. Now, again, what I'm doing now is a combination of a couple of things. First, I am drawing the scene as I see it. So I place the horizon line, which is where the ocean is, the very edge, the farthest line. Then there are a couple of rock formations, one on the extreme right, one on the extreme left. Then you got this wave coming and crashing towards us. And notice the wave has this sort of an S snake-like pattern. It starts from the left, exactly where I'm working right now, and it moves to the right, gets to the rock on the right, and then it takes another turn back to the left and goes into the other rock, and then it goes again a bit to the right through the rock that's smaller and closer to us. So you get this beautiful S shape, okay? This is what I meant when I said the focal point here, in a way, isn't necessarily the rocks. It can be whatever you decide, honestly, but the rocks, despite being very dark, aren't necessarily the focal point. The waves here are what at least fascinated me about the scene. So yeah, so I'm going at it relatively, and you'll see later on in the painting stage, relatively quickly. It is possible to take it slower. I'm going to say also I'm not the biggest expert in seascapes. I have a long way to go and a lot to learn about how to portray water. So I did my best, but hopefully I will be able to improve these skills and maybe in the future do one that's a little more realistic from up close. But from afar, I think I got a pretty good impression. So here I am drawing the patterns of the foam and the sparkles on the water surface. Okay, here's the white sparkles next to those rocks. And it's very tricky. What you want to do when you're drawing this kind of a scene is you want a drawing that you will understand. So it's not necessarily, there's definitely not just one way of doing it, but it's even beyond that. Different people will have a different way of expressing what they see in this scene. So some people may draw the rock formation, others may draw the actual ripples and the foam and all of those things. It really depends on how you're accustomed to painting. And if you just get started and you don't have that much experience, just choose a way. Go at it. Try it out. You can always have multiple attempts if you mess one up, but don't let lack of knowledge hurt your desire to paint. You know, if you look at this scene and you think to yourself, how am I going to approach this? This is so complex. Give it a go. Be even, a little careless with it. It's fine. Don't worry about it. Just try it out, okay, and see what happens. So now I'm going over all of the things that are darker. That's a part of my symbolism to let myself know where everything is. And I'm darkening the dark areas with some hatching, just pencil lines, so that later on I have another anchor point to know where I am across the canvas, so to speak, or the paper in our case. Now look at the sky. The sky has this very beautiful, I think, it's a bit of a cerulean-ish blue. And then as we get to the waves, it's more of the French ultramarine. And then the closer it is more cerulean or phthalo blue. So I'm using whatever colors I have. So for the sky, I am using French ultramarine. This is a little more muted, a little more subdued blue. And as I'll get closer, you'll see me start adding in the phthalo blues and the stronger blues. This is pure ultramarine mixed in with some pre-mixtures that were there on the palette. I'm painting the shape of the sky around the clouds. You see the clouds there in the distance. But I don't care about the sky too much. In fact, I'd rather avoid too many details there. Now look at what I'm doing, because it's not going to compete with the waves and all of that. Now look at what I'm doing. While the wash is still wet, okay, I'm putting in obviously some wet in the sky, but while it is still wet, I'm actually going to mix the water to be the consistency of the rock on the right and of the water of the ocean, the actual water that's much darker. What this will do, and you'll see in a moment, is create a gradual transition from the sky to the ocean. The horizon line is so far here in this scene, it's so farther from us that I want there to be a very gradual transition. Okay, so here I am mixing a dark blue and just touching the wash that's already wet. Now, because it's the opposite way in terms of the paper's angle, the water is not going to climb up too much. It's going to spread out a bit up, but mostly it's going to move downwards. Okay, and then what this does is I get a line that's semi-soft, but also pretty controlled. And that's how I get the farther area. Now notice where I'm stopping with this wash is where the waves are, because the waves have this foam and it's paper white. I'm going to leave those white. Okay, there's no need for me to go into too many details there. So yeah, I've shown you actually in the Painting Masters series quite a lot of artists that are very interesting with their seascapes. So there's a lot to look at. Some of the recent episodes there were really incredible artists. Now look at this rock on the right. What matters here is not necessarily the shape of the rock, but rather the shape that I'm leaving under the rock to living under a rock. The shape that I'm leaving under the rock or below the rock to express the waves crashing against it. Whatever I mess up at this stage, I'm going to have to come back with opaque paint and recreate. So it's better if you can leave it for the paper white. Now, I already messed up some of their shapes, the waves. And this rock, in retrospect, should probably be a little cooler, not as red as I've made it. But yeah, that's fine. That's part of it. So now I'm continuing and building, again, the sea under that wave. This is a little more of a happy saturated blue. So I'm using more of the phthalo blue. And again, I'm stopping below where the next foam in the water is. So I'm using the areas that are white as a stop line. This is a concept I talked about before. Stop lines allow you to know where the wash ends, and you don't have to worry about anything below them or above them. In any case, it's usually below because water moves down. But yeah, so you see I know where I can stop, which is really important. Now I'm connecting the upper part to the lower part, and I'm continuing. And notice what I'm doing. I'm creating the shape of the waves and ripples and all of that using the ocean and the water around it. Okay. Now my interpretation of the waves could be better. It's a little clumsy. That's, I think, a good word to describe it. It's a little clumsy. The edges are unclear. Notice there's a bit of green in the middle, so I'm adding a bit of green. That's at least how I see it. It should be a bit of a more phthalo-y green, but that's fine. It still works. I'm using sap green. Just a more natural color, I think. And so yeah, my interpretation of the waves crashing and all of that, it's a bit amateuristic in a way. It's something I still have to work on, really. Maybe it's a matter of patience, working slower, working in small isolated sections, and I will try having another go at this, or maybe I'll find a similar scene that's a little simpler, because I do want to give this a try. One of the ways in which I can express these waves and the ripples is by using the side of the brush to do this dry brushy effect, and that'll create edges that are broken, because if you look at the waves there, they have these sparkles around them. They're broken lines. Now, another thing you can do if you're not like me and you don't mind using masking fluid or masking tape, you can mask those areas off, and then you can devote more attention to your wash. In fact, it is something I want to try doing in the future. It's a work method that makes more sense, I'll be honest. There's no reason not to use any means possible to make it easier to do a wash very evenly and just without worry, about the negative shapes, especially when it's this complex, because this is really complex. So yeah, you don't have to do this like me, but that's my way of doing it. Sometimes you can say it's a lazy way. I will do another iteration of this. I've been putting so much effort into drawing and sketching people that my watercolor has not been suffering, but I didn't make too big of a progress in the last maybe 4 to 6 weeks. So yeah, but yes, I still have a lot to work on. But now, as we get closer, notice the changes in color. So this area gets a little bluer. It's still a muted blue, so I'm going to mute it a bit. And then where the rock shows, it gets a little more brown. And then under it, it's a little yellowy green. So all of these different transitions, try getting them in. If you can, get them in evenly, because that's what will help the first wash look good and pleasing to the eye. And it's water. And watercolor is perfect to paint water. You get this smooth transition, and it's just a great medium for that. So you see I'm starting to put this brown, yellowy kind of color there. I'm not super accurate with them, but that's fine. It is a challenge for me to mix an accurate color still. It's something I don't usually care about, but when I do, I find it to be challenging. So yeah, now down below there's a bunch of foam and white highlights and a lot of different things like that. So I'm going to try and do this economically and as easily as I can. So I'm not going to go into all of those small details. I'm just going to put in a couple of shapes, and then I'm going to use the water sprayer to spread some of them out, maybe also the brush, and get the overall feeling of the area. Okay, sometimes it's really hard to recreate exactly what you see, and it is possible. And while it is possible, it's just, you choose your battles, so to speak. So that's not necessarily the thing I'll break my head over. You could do it in some areas. You could do it in the entire painting. For example, this painting took me about an hour, so that's not too long. And there wasn't any drying time because I used a hairdryer. But had I worked on it really slowly and meticulously, it would have probably been 3 hours, something like that. But that's still not that long. So 3 hours, you can produce probably a more realistic rendition of this. Still with some expressionism in it. So here's the thing. I pre-wet some areas with the sprayer. So there will be a bit of movement, but still not a lot. Now look at the area where I'm painting right now. It's just a little darker. If you try and really squint your eyes, take a few steps back, it's not as light as the mid section, okay? And here I'm attempting to get it to be a little darker. Now, as you'll see later, this wasn't enough, okay? It was still too watery. Now I'm coming back with water to blend the edge, so just water, and it mixes. But still, it wasn't enough. So you'll see me later coming back with some more paint and darkening it some more. Now, the reason why it is important to darken the edges is this will lead to a better sense of light in the middle. And that's very often what will happen. Usually you see this with cityscapes, where if you want to put an emphasis on one area of light, then shading perhaps the foreground can help making the middle ground lighter. So it's all in relations to, every area is in relations to the other areas. So yeah, I'm darkening the sides, makes the front a little, the middle a little lighter. Okay, now there is a bit of this, muted blue down below. I could have muted it some more. This is way too saturated. But I am trying to express that. Now a lot of water, I'm spraying a lot of water to spread it out, to get it even. You could pre-wet and then do wet and wet, or you could just use water sprayer and spread out whatever you already put to paper, okay? And this is also a good opportunity to try and create some ripple effects. So this crisscross pattern, what you often see as shadows under boats, it's a good opportunity to get these kinds of details in. Now I forgot which was the artist. It's funny how I always forget these things, but the artist that does insane seascapes, like the best I've seen. Actually, I have to dig it up and tell you. It's one of the recent episodes, and it also got quite a lot of views. So I think high chances that you've seen his work. Let me check. Oh yeah, so it's Sergey Temerev. Sergey, S-E-R-G-E-Y, Temerev, T-E-M-E-R-E-V. That's Painting Masters episode 54. You definitely want to check that out. And I'm going to write myself down a note to link to that. Painting Masters 54. I'm going to write it down. Because I always forget to add the links to other relevant videos. Temerev. So if you really want to see a good example of how to do this as professionally as possible, then his work is really, really worth checking out. So here I'm starting to add, just to the lower section, while it's still wet, these rock formations. Now it looks it's very tricky because the rocks are covered by the waves and the water. The water basically flows over it. And what it does is it skews the colors a bit. It makes them a little darker, but more saturated, or a little brighter. Okay, it depends on the situation, really. I won't pretend to know exactly what happens there, but this needs some more burnt sienna, actually, and hopefully I'll add that later on. But you see how the formation is really, you can see it through the waves, and the challenge is how to disconnect from the illusion of what it appears to look like and paint it as you see it, because the color there is a very muted brown. And it's very easy to tell yourself in your mind, oh, it's a rock, so it's probably really a saturated brown, and then you end up with this very bright brown. So it's just a matter of detaching from what you know is there and actually painting it as it is. It also relates to the concept that I talked about of understanding versus observation, but that's off topic. We won't get into that. But now this is missing some burnt sienna, so I'm going to add that in just a moment. And you see, wherever I can add these rocks that exist in the reference and it's still wet, that's really good, because it's gonna lead to some blended edges, and you see these rocks are not prominent, some of them. This one I'm working on in particular now is prominent. It's pretty dry brushy, you get some water sparkles on it. The rest is fairly blended, especially because it's underwater. Okay, that's the big challenge with these kinds of views, and it's really beautiful. If you can find quite a few artists that do almost photorealistic watercolors of these types of views and rock formations, and it's just very impressive. And I think it's worth, I'm going to give you a quick tip, it's worth doing a series of paintings of a similar subject. So doing several of these cityscapes consecutively. So maybe one today, another one in 2 days or tomorrow, and that works really well for seeing great improvement in one particular skill set. I find that consolidating the effort of a certain skill is really useful sometimes. So I'll do that. I'll paint a couple of cars, then I'll paint a couple of buildings. So yeah. Now look at the foreground here. I'm starting to indicate this very abstract pattern of waters moving from the right to the left. It's not easy to get this kind of a thing done accurately, and if you give a few people, you let them paint the scene, everyone will do something completely different, because a lot of it is personal impression. So the way you interpret the waves, especially in the foreground where it's so... I don't want to say it's subjective, because obviously there's a reference photo and it's very clear, but the exact way in which you portray the crashing waves is really... Notice these beautiful dry brush effects, just to convey that some water is flying around and sparkling. But yeah, this... I forgot my point, but you get it. Okay, it's just really... it's a challenge to paint these views. It can be very hard at first. Start simple. Start with maybe just one rock. Remember the video I said about, I told you about focal points and how to focus on one small thing. You don't have to tackle this complete scene. You can choose a small section from it. For example, the top right corner really looks nice, and it has everything. It has the sea, it has the water crashing against the stone, it has the sky. Very often a mistake we make is to just choose too challenging of references to work from. And so if you have that kind of a thing going, you can use smaller ones, okay? Now this rock, the inside of the rock isn't as important, maybe excluding some highlights from the waves crashing that I'm going to add later, but the outline of the shape is really important. So very often I'll be more concerned with the outlines of shapes rather than the inside of them. It's like this thing, it's really interesting. I don't know if you know this, but you can take a big text, like a couple of paragraphs with words, and you can change all of the words in the middle of all the letters in the middle of the words, but keep the first letter and last letter the same, and you will be able to read it like 90% of the time, which is pretty crazy because our brains are wired to see the start and end of a word. So you can take a couple of sentences, change with every word, you change all of the letters in the middle, but the ones on the start and end. So it's kind of a similar thing with shapes. You'll still be able to read those words. It's crazy. So with shapes, it's the same. As long as the outline makes sense, the overall value also makes sense maybe, you will be able to read it as rock formation or as even a person, even for more complex subjects. I'm going to blow my nose. So yeah, the rocks in the foreground really are a challenge. I'm trying to just put them in as basically as I can and not overdo it. You see I'm spraying some water just to break off all of the harsh edges because it's all very blurry and blended. Now it dried, you saw the cut, so everything is dry now. But in any case, yeah, the rocks, you just either you go really accurate and slow, or you take your time, or you go, fast and impressionistic. It's a skill that comes with time. So the ability to express what you see and with any subject, it's something that develops with time. Now, it's important to note, this area, as you can see, it's not fully dry because I just sprayed a little bit of water there before I put in this wash. So you see some of the left edges started to move together and blend, which was important for me. And as I mentioned, the previous wash, I did not get it to be dark enough. So now I have to go back and add another layer. Now I'm tilting the paper to the left just to help the excess paint that got stuck to move to the left. And then I can blend it out either with a tissue, but this time maybe with a brush. You just put the brush on it, you'll see, and move it, okay? So yeah, that smooths out the edge of this slightly darker addition. And we're about 2/3, I think, of the process done. What's left now is to add these beautiful highlights to the areas that I missed. And I missed quite a lot of them. And by the way, if you really want to get this kind of a painting very accurately, it can help to use bigger piece of paper. This is a little too small for all the details you see there. It is still possible. In fact, maybe I'll do this as an experiment. I'll try painting another version, slower, more measured and calculated. We'll see. But yeah, every place that I missed highlights, I missed foam, I missed water flying across the rocks or the water surface even, I'm going to add that now. I'm using the same John Brilliant paint by Shinhan PWC. I'm going to link down in the description. You'll see exactly the place where the name of the color, you'll see the properties. You can find it. I don't know if you can find it online, like on Amazon. Here it's easy to get locally, but you can find a lot of replacements to it if you know the pigment. So yeah. So you see I'm working into the rock, okay? I'm working from left and up and right. And that hopefully creates the effect of water crashing against the rock. Now this is very much a painting that when you look from up close, there is a big mess. But then when you take a few steps back, it makes sense as the scene, and I think it does look good. Now that I'm squinting my eyes, I can see a lot of similarities. Ideally, I think these ripple patterns on the water's surface could have been, interpreted a little better. It's just so hard to know what highlights to leave at every stage of the way. It just requires very slow and methodical work in a way. Something I'm still working on, to be honest. But yeah, you get to see my impression at the moment. I'm very pleased that I have this documentation of how I painted from back in 2015, 16, 17, 18. You can see really the progression, the trajectory. And I think some of these videos are really proof that it's it's not like you're not born with the skill. You learn a lot, and you can improve greatly, even if you feel like you don't have it, or all of that. Now look at these lines. They express how the water flow on top of all of these rocks that are a little submerged in the water. And that's a really nice effect. I think this part I got really nicely. And a part of the feeling of depth here comes from, if you compare the rocks and the transitions, look at this beautiful transition from blue, muted blue, into a brown. It's all very smooth and very gradual. But on top of that, on the surface of the water, you get these lovely ripples that are sharp, white, sharp ripples. And the difference, and I've mentioned this a few times before, the difference in contrast between softer edges and then on top of them sharper edges can really make a big difference. It's the same kind of thing you'll see when I paint a building, and then the initial wash is very blended and blurry, and then I add dry brush. It gives it sometimes solidity, and sometimes it gives it a sense of depth, because we interpret the thing that's sharper as closer to us. And in this case, all of these small, white ripples on the surface of the water, we interpret them as closer to us. Okay, so it's just one more thing to have in mind. I really do, when I painted this, I thought to myself, maybe I should paint this in acrylics and see how it goes, just for the experience. And I may do that. I should probably buy better acrylics. I have they're not as good of a quality. So now you see I'm blending back some of these white highlights that are a little too starking. And now comes okay, so this is an important stage too. Usually, I haven't used the pen in a while. This is a white gel pen, Signo, S-I-G-N-O, Uniball. You can get it on eBay. You can get it in many places. I'm going to link it down below as well, or at least write the name. Some of the details here are way too gentle for the white opaque paint. So I'm doing these with the pen itself. I just need thinner lines. The good thing about the pen is that it's a cool white too, so it's like a perfect white, while the opaque paint is a little warmer, as I told you a few times. It's jaune. It's like jaune is, I believe, yellow. So yeah, and you see all of these small little ripples on the water surface. Honestly, unless you really work slowly and carefully, and it will take, again, 4 or 5 hours maybe even, you won't get all of them in. So either you make a decision to go super detailed, that's fine with me, or you're like me and you enjoy the overall impression, so you just express these with these very simplified lines. And I actually love the way this looks with the simplified lines. I think it works really well in expressing it. And when you take a few steps back from the painting, I think it makes a whole lot more sense. But in any case, I hope you enjoyed this one. And now I'm going to remove the tape, sign this, and wrap it up. So here we go, final result. I think one of the challenges here is being able to get all the highlights negatively painted in one go without having to resort to adding them in later. And I think that's something I definitely want to work on and improve. Really a big challenge. And I have seen very experienced artists able to do that, so hopefully in the future I will be able to, and it'll just give off a cleaner result, less of a need to go this heavy on the opaque paint, which I actually have no problem with. So you saw me doing quite a lot of editing work after the first wash, but in any case, here is the final result. I hope you like this one. I'm going to show it to you up close, some of the details. And again, for me, if from afar you can tell what you're looking at and it makes sense, and it even looks a little realistic, then I'm happy with the result. Obviously, I would love to, and I'm working towards improving the sense of realism a little more. But in any case, I hope you enjoyed this one. Now let's wrap it up face to face. So thank you so much for watching. I really do appreciate it. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to drop a like and a comment down below. It really helps me reach more people. I hope you liked the final effect created here. Again, I had to resort to quite a lot of opaque paint. That's fine, that's part of it. And if I do want to create another version of this, maybe a little slower, I just didn't want that, because honestly, with this kind of complexity, it can take like 5 hours just to get this painting done. I didn't want to go this detailed. But I did want to capture all of these beautiful foamy shapes, negative painting around all of these highlights, essentially. And I really hope you enjoyed this one. If you want to learn how to paint freely, let go, enjoy the process, and get the results you want, be sure to check out the frustration-free watercolor course. Link is always down in the description box below. If you have already gotten it, thank you so much. I really appreciate it. I know quite a lot of people have gotten it. So thank you so much for watching, and I will see you again in the next vid real soon.